Julia felt her heart pounding in her chest as the bedroom door closed behind Richard. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by her ragged breathing. She sat on the floor, trying to gather her thoughts, but her mind was clouded with pain and fear. He had come home later than usual, and Julia knew that could only mean trouble. Richard had long since lost any semblance of control. What started as dominance, dictating what she wore, who she talked to, and even what she thought, had spiraled into something far worse. He was a monster now, lashing out without warning. And the harder Julia tried to do everything right, the crueler he became. That evening, his eyes burned with a cold, merciless fire. Every movement he made carried an undercurrent of menace. His footsteps down the hallway echoed like the approach of a storm. Julia rose shakily from the floor, trying to appear composed, but it was useless. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he could hear it reverberating through the empty prison of their home. He was angrier than usual. She didn't know what had set him off this time, but she understood all too well. It could be anything. His glare was sharp as a blade when he entered the room and saw that she hadn't changed her hairstyle. He didn't like that she looked too plain, failing to meet his impossible standards. He grabbed her by the hair, yanking her toward the mirror. The sharp pain spread from her scalp as he snarled. "You look like you've forgotten how to be my wife, Julia. Is that what you want? You want me to start looking at someone else? I won't let you become like this." His voice was icy, slicing through her like a knife. "Don't you understand yet, Julia?" He tightened his grip on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You're mine. Don't you ever forget it." Her skin throbbed with pain, but she couldn't resist. She couldn't do anything. Her will had been shattered, like an old piece of wood breaking under too much weight. Richard laughed, the sound low and guttural, like bones grinding against the earth. He grabbed her hair again, pulling so hard it felt as if her scalp might tear. Dragging her to the mirror, he forced her to look at herself. Her eyes were red and swollen from tears, her face pale, and her lips stained with blood. Lifting her face with cruel fingers, he forced her to meet his gaze in the reflection. "You can't change anything. You never will." He stepped back, watching her tremble. Raising his hand, he struck her hard in the stomach. The air rushed out of her lungs in a sharp gasp, and she doubled over in pain but didn't fall. He shoved her against the wall, her head hitting it with a dull thud. Before she could recover, he grabbed her hair again, jerking her face toward his. "If you think this is over, you don't understand who's in control here," he hissed. Her body felt like it might collapse under the weight of the pain. Her thoughts were scattered. There was nothing left but wave after wave of agony. He left her crumpled on the floor, her breaths shallow and uneven. Looking down at her, he exuded a cruel satisfaction, reveling in his power to destroy her, to bend her into his possession. "This is how it will always be," he said, walking toward the door, ignoring her feeble attempts to compose herself. "You're not going anywhere. You're mine, my creation." The door slammed shut, leaving Julia alone with her fear. Her mind raced with the horrifying realization that she was no longer a person, but an object, something to be broken and rebuilt according to his twisted will. "Don't take it personally, love," he added as he turned back to her, his tone mockingly soft. "You brought this on yourself. I'm just teaching you how to behave. But you know I love you, right, sweetheart?" He approached her, and before she could muster any resistance, he grabbed her roughly, forcing a kiss. Julia's body recoiled with disgust, but she couldn't move. His grip was ironclad. He made her submit, and she obeyed silently, without a choice, her spirit crushed under the weight of his dominance. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, cold sweat beading on her forehead. Richard had been asleep for hours, his heavy snoring filling the room as he sprawled across the massive bed that once symbolized their shared world. Now, it was nothing but a reminder of the prison closing in on her day by day. She looked at his face, the dark hair tousled against the pillow, but all she felt was contempt. He was no longer her husband, he was her captor. And Julia knew this had to end. The fear, the confinement, everything had to end. For weeks, she debated if she could go through with it. Her heart pounded, each beat like a drum signaling a final decision. She had tried to escape before, but her attempts always failed. Richard seemed to anticipate her every move. This time, though, she had a plan. It was her only chance. Julia slipped her hand beneath the pillow and retrieved the small phone she had hidden for months. Her fingers trembled as she opened a message from her new allies, the people who had arranged everything. Her mother was safe, relocated to a shelter. Now all that remained was the final step. In just a few days, she and Richard were supposed to take a night trip on his yacht. He was thrilled about the idea, a romantic evening alone on the water. He believed it would be a perfect moment for them. Julia knew it was the perfect moment for her escape. That night, she prepared meticulously, practicing her swimming and reviewing every movement she would need to make. She had hidden her essentials in the utility room downstairs. Quietly, without any sudden moves, she convinced herself that every step brought her closer to freedom. Her skin prickled with tension as her heart beat in sync with her footsteps. She pulled an old backpack from her closet, the one she had packed weeks ago. Inside were her vital documents, some cash, a few changes of clothes, and medicine to sustain her until she found refuge. Standing before the large mirror in the bedroom, Julia tried to mask her anxiety with a calm expression. She combed her hair methodically, attempting to appear indifferent. Richard stood by the window, gazing at the ocean that stretched into an inky abyss. Their coastal home was tranquil, almost mystical, but Julia felt the oppressive weight of the tension filling the space. Tonight's boat trip was the key, the chance she had been waiting for. Avoiding Richard's gaze, Julia hid her turmoil behind a composed exterior. For months, she had prepared for this, knowing she couldn't afford a single mistake. One slip and he would catch her. When they left the house, Richard was relaxed, entirely unsuspecting. As always, he exuded confidence in his ability to control everything. Julia followed him silently, careful not to draw attention. They got into the car and he started the engine. The wind howled outside, but Richard seemed oblivious to the dark clouds gathering above their home. By the time they reached the yacht, the night had grown darker and the waves more restless. Richard ignored the building storm, focused on maneuvering the vessel. Julia's heart pounded faster, her breath catching in her throat. She could sense the storm approaching and knew this was her moment. She watched as Richard concentrated on steering, oblivious to how quickly his perfect evening was unraveling. Every movement Julia made was deliberate, yet determined. As the storm intensified, the yacht began to pitch and sway violently. Richard, visibly frustrated, yelled over the howling wind that they needed to head back to shore. Julia knew there would be no going back. Not for her. As the yacht tilted with the swells, she strapped on a life jacket. While Richard was preoccupied with trying to regain control, she moved swiftly, seizing her chance. In one decisive motion, Julia hurled herself overboard into the churning sea. Waves crashed against Julia's body with relentless force, dragging her into the dark waters. Every movement made her breath grow heavier. She fought with everything she had, clinging to the hope that her plan would succeed. Each gasp felt unbearable, the weight of the water suffocating her. But Julia pushed through, defying the current with sheer determination. Her heart pounded wildly, a mix of terror and an unfamiliar spark of joy. Maybe it actually worked. I'm free, she thought, barely able to believe her own courage. From the deck of the yacht, Richard couldn't see her. He stood there, shouting her name, his voice drowned out by the storm's howling winds. "Julia! Julia!" he bellowed, his cries swallowed by the raging sea. Panic and fury twisted his face as he scanned the waves. His arms flailed, his movements erratic, desperate. He couldn't comprehend how she had disappeared. Rescue crews worked frantically to search the water, but they found nothing. "This can't be happening. She couldn't have escaped," he yelled, his voice filled with desperation and threats. Richard spiraled into a frenzy, convincing himself, and anyone who would listen, that it was all just an accident. His steps weren't weighed by grief but by a need to reclaim control. His anguish for Julia was a thinly veiled cover for his rage and fear. He barked at the rescuers, berated his friends who had accompanied him, as if their incompetence was to blame. "If you think you can just run from me, Julia," he hissed under his breath, "I will find you, and when I do, you won't even begin to imagine what's coming." His words were heavy, rumbling like thunder, a promise of destruction. But Julia was far away. She had dragged herself onto the shore, her body battered and freezing, but her resolve to survive gave her strength. Everything had been meticulously planned down to the smallest detail. The bag she had secretly packed with essentials was hidden back at the house, waiting for her. While Richard and the search teams were consumed by the chaos on the water, Julia snuck back to the house, retrieved her belongings, and left without a trace. Her heart raced with adrenaline, but her focus was unshakable. Julia made her way to a small town in Iowa, where even the wind felt different. She understood perfectly that her freedom depended on how invisible she could make herself. Richard had extensive connections, and it wouldn't take much for him to track her down if she didn't cover her tracks. So, she decided to completely reinvent herself. She changed her hair from blonde to a deep chestnut brown, cutting it short to obscure most of her face. Her naturally striking features, which could have given her away, were hidden behind thick glasses she started wearing to mask her expressive eyes. She practiced new makeup techniques for weeks to alter her appearance even further. Her demeanor shifted, becoming more reserved and composed, ensuring she wouldn't draw unnecessary attention. Julia adopted a new name, Lana Brooke. A simple, forgettable name, one that could blend into the background. She used the alias everywhere in her new town. It was her final step toward truly starting a new life, erasing any trace of the woman she used to be. No one recognized her, and that anonymity was her lifeline. Here, among quiet streets and modest homes, Julia felt her first fleeting sense of peace. She began working at the local library, meeting kind-hearted people who gradually became her support system. For the first time, she could speak and think freely without fear. She even found herself drawn to a local schoolteacher, someone whose warmth and kindness made her feel safe. Julia didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she was grateful for the chance to simply be herself. Meanwhile, Richard was left alone. No one suspected that Julia had survived. He forced himself to believe she had drowned, convincing himself her death was just another sign of her unknown weakness. But deep down, an unease gnawed at him. Her disappearance haunted him. Though he tried to mask his vulnerability with an air of indifference, his eyes betrayed a growing emptiness. He didn't know what to do next. Everything he had worked to control now seemed meaningless. Julia had escaped, and he might never be able to get her back. Richard stood frozen in the dark, the flickering bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across his face. The crack in his heart, the one that had shattered his illusion of control, widened with every passing moment. He couldn't comprehend how Julia had slipped out of his life so easily, leaving him in a world where all he could see were shattered plans and a tarnished reputation. But the more he dwelled on it, the more it fueled his hatred. She had no right. It all started with something small, her wedding ring. When Martin, his private investigator, handed over the latest findings, Richard immediately noticed the familiar detail. The ring Julia had flushed down the toilet, thinking she'd erased it from his reach. That tiny object became her fatal mistake, the thread he could pull to unravel her escape. "You really think you can get away?" he growled, her image haunting his thoughts like a ghost. Richard slammed the papers onto the table. His jaw clenched as he replayed every moment, every weakness she'd ever shown. Julia had always tried to mask her emotions, to appear in control, but he had seen through her every time. She was an open book to him. Martin had uncovered another key clue. Julia had been taking swimming lessons in her old town. That discovery ignited the fire of his obsession. She'd always feared the water after that accident, and yet now she was learning to swim? It was preparation. She had planned this. Richard's blood boiled as he pieced it together. She'd been preparing for her escape long before she made her move. He couldn't sit still, couldn't remain calm. Every step she'd taken, every new connection she'd formed, only stoked his determination to track her down. Her pathetic attempts to start over, her careful rebuilding of a new life, they all fed his hatred and desire for revenge. He wouldn't let her go. She won't hide. She can't hide, he whispered through gritted teeth, a twisted smile forming on his lips. There was no warmth in that smile, no trace of humor, just the raw edge of fear and obsession channeled into determination. He refused to believe she had truly escaped him, and when he found her, she would belong to him again. "You have no idea how this ends, Julia," he murmured into the empty room, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. "But you'll be mine, no matter what." Richard, having lost the last shred of his humanity, climbed the stairs to her apartment like a demon closing in on its prey. His heart pounded so violently that there was no room left for thoughts of her past suffering he had always controlled. Now, his only desire was to destroy her, to obliterate her escape and exact revenge for the insult she had dealt him by defying his power and control. Richard stood in the dim light of her apartment, his silhouette looming menacingly against the weak glow of a desk lamp. A knife gleamed in his hand, his eyes blazing with fury. He had gone through hell to find her, and now he had no intention of leaving her alive. Julia, crouched behind the kitchen table, felt her legs trembling beneath her. Her perfectly calculated plan unraveled the moment he crossed the threshold. "Come out, Julia." Richard's voice sliced through the silence like a blade. "I know you're here. Do you really think you can hide? Do you think you'll escape me again?" She held her breath, praying she could remain invisible. But he already knew. He always knew how to find her. Richard moved through the room like a storm, leaving chaos in his wake. He overturned chairs, smashed furniture, and scattered her belongings. His voice thundered with anger and venom. "You betrayed me, Julia," he roared, slamming the knife into the table. The wood splintered under the force of his blows. "You thought you could fool me? I made you, and now I'll destroy you." Julia, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth to stifle any sound, felt her heart pounding like a drum. But she knew fear wouldn't save her. She had to fight. As Richard approached the kitchen table, she suddenly grabbed the knife lying nearby and lunged at him. Her scream was filled with desperation and resolve. The blade grazed his shoulder, drawing blood but only briefly halting him. "Really?" he sneered, wiping the blood from his shoulder with his sleeve. "Is that the best you've got?" He grabbed her by the hair and slammed her against the wall. Pain exploded in her head, and for a moment, she nearly blacked out. Blood trickled down her temple, but she forced herself to stand. "You're not human, Richard," she spat, glaring at him through the pain. "You're a monster." "A monster?" he hissed, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "No, Julia, you made me this way, with your pathetic little dream of freedom." He punched her in the stomach, sending her to her knees, gasping for air. Raising the knife, he loomed over her. "This ends now," he growled. Julia knew this was her last chance. She remembered the second knife she had hidden in the pocket of her sweater. As Richard swung down, she thrust the blade into his thigh with all her strength. He roared in pain, staggering back and dropping to one knee. "You've got some bite," he rasped, clutching his injured leg. "But it won't be enough." With a sudden lunge, he grabbed her by the throat, his fingers tightening around her neck. Julia thrashed, her lungs screaming for air, but his strength was overwhelming. "You thought you could beat me?" he shouted, his eyes wild with madness. "You're nothing without me. Nothing." In a final burst of desperation, she kneed him in the stomach, forcing him to loosen his grip. Gasping for breath, Julia grabbed the knife again and stabbed him in the chest. Once, twice, 3 times. Blood poured from his wounds, pooling on the floor, but even as his body weakened, his eyes burned with hatred. "You think this is the end?" he wheezed, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "You'll never be free. I'll always be with you." His body collapsed to the floor, lifeless. But it wasn't over. As he fell, he struck the gas stove, dislodging a valve. The sharp smell of gas filled the room. Julia noticed the spark from the damaged lamp just as it ignited the gas. The flames engulfed the apartment, consuming everything in their path. Richard burned with his hatred, and Julia found peace in the fire that finally ended her torment. And remember, even when it seems like the nightmare is over, the darkness can return. So always stay alert, because sometimes the darkest moments begin when you least expect them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. How would you have gotten out of this situation? I'd love to hear your ideas.